We Presbyterians occupy a kind of middle ground between the more hierarchical governance used by Roman Catholics and Episcopalians and the congregational form used by many Baptists. In the former, a bishop appoints a priest to a congregation. In the latter, there is no bishop, and the congregation can hire whomever they want as their pastor. But we Presbyterians don't really look like either of these. When it comes to pastors, congregations cannot hire or fire pastors on their own. They must work with the presbytery, the regional governing body, in the comings and goings of pastors. When a pastor nominating committee is looking for a new pastor, they must follow the procedures outlined by the denomination, and any candidate must be vetted by and approved by the presbytery. When a pastor nominating committee, or P&C as we call them, begins the work of looking for a pastor, they must utilize procedures and methods that the presbytery prescribes, and they must utilize certain forms. Among these is a form they must sign that attests that the presbytery's equal employment opportunity and affirmative action policy has been explained to them and that they have agreed to abide by it. One of the policy's stated purpose is to inhibit discrimination in employment because of race, color, national origin, sex, age, marital status, or disability, and to ensure fairness to all candidates. To help this happen, the presbytery requires P&C to interview a diverse group of candidates, regardless of the racial makeup of the congregation. There's even a requirement that the P&C visit or interview a female and hear her preach. There's a lot of effort to make sure that this attempt to be diverse in the search process goes on. There's even forms that have to be filled out that in writing attest that this is being followed. Yet despite such procedures, white congregations almost always end up with a white pastor. And even in 2021, among such congregations, it's more likely that a married white man will be a senior pastor. You might think that with this requirement to interview a diverse group of people, that occasionally a P&C would be wowed by someone who didn't look like their last pastor. But apparently not. I can't imagine that anyone on the P&C actually says out loud, well, we're only looking for white men. But somehow, it seems that everyone knows it. I should also add that a P&C's job is to seek the one God is calling. It isn't to look for the one they like or the one that looks like them. It is to find the one God has in mind as their next pastor. Apparently, God has a preference for married white men. In our scripture reading this morning, a king nominating committee of one heads to Bethlehem looking for a new king for Israel. Now, clearly, this is a much less formal and regimented process than the one we Presbyterians use for looking for pastors. But no doubt there were still expectations about the qualities that a king candidate would have. I take it that Eliab, the oldest son of Jesse, has such qualities in abundance. Our scripture implies that he is tall and impressive looking, kingly, you might say. And the nominating committee is clearly impressed. This is the one, he says, and Samuel is all ready to offer Eliab the job. If Eliab had been a pastor candidate, no doubt the PNC would have extended a call to be the next pastor. But God has other ideas. And God says to the nominating committee, do not look upon the appearance or the height of his stature, because I have rejected him. And amazingly, the committee listens. I say amazingly because committees, even committees of one, are typically not very good at listening for God. I've often shared a quote from Graham Standish about church committees. He writes that figuratively and literally, committees in most churches begin a meeting by inviting God into the room in prayer. Then, by what they do and how they discuss proposals and make decisions, they basically tell God to wait outside in the hall until they've made their decision. Finally, through their closing prayers, they invite God back in to bless their decision. Samuel apparently doesn't work that way. He's open to God, and so he hears God's no, even as all the sons pass by and he's running out of candidates. Typically, search committees start to get desperate about that time, but not Samuel. He is still able to say no when the last candidate is there. Of course, there's still God's candidate, but Samuel doesn't know that when he passes on the very last candidate that passes in front of him. He doesn't know what God has in mind. How is it that Samuel is able to hear what it is that God does and doesn't want? Does he have one of those earpieces like the Secret Service has, and God speaks directly into his ear? If so, I'd really like to get one. Or is it not like that at all? Perhaps Samuel doesn't hear voices in his head. Perhaps he's simply a man of deep prayer who stays extremely open to the presence of God, to divine nudges and prods, the divine nudges and prods that many of us have felt on occasions in our lives. He's simply more open than many of us, more attentive to God than many of us. And so I'm betting that most pastor nominating committees would still have taken Eliab. Along with many others, we Presbyterians say that Christ alone is head of the church. And if that's so, then why would most nominating committees have chosen Eliab? Why would we have gone with the one that impressed us off the bat? Why do so many congregations continue to hire married white men, passing over qualified candidates who are the wrong color or gender or marital status? We say Jesus is head of the church, but very often we don't act like that is true. Instead, we substitute our own preferences, our own logic, our own judgments for those of Jesus. Is that because we've never learned how to listen for the voice of Jesus, to wait for the Spirit? Or is it because doing it ourselves is a lot easier and faster, a lot less likely to cause upset in a congregation, a lot more likely to maintain the status quo than risking what the Spirit might say? And these are hardly academic questions in our day and time. Across the board, large and small, conservative and liberal, church congregations are struggling. Attendance is down. Giving is down. Millennials and other young people are opting out of organized religion. Clearly, the way we've always done it simply isn't working anymore. That's one reason I was quite impressed and quite proud of the way the session, the governing body here at FCPC, listened for the Spirit, listened for where Jesus was calling this church in the time before the pandemic. During that time, in the renew process that played out over several years, the session was remarkably attentive to Jesus' voice. There was an openness to the Spirit that I have rarely witnessed in a congregation. And I only wish that every member of the congregation could have been there to see it. But the pandemic interrupted the next steps as Renew itself came to a close and we began to live into the call that Renew had discerned. Now, as we inch closer and closer to some sort of new normal, it will be easy to forget that call and simply slip back into old patterns. But God is not calling us to go backwards, but rather to boldly move forward along the way that Jesus walks and is beckoning us to follow. There's a famous quote from John Wesley, the 18th century preacher and revivalist who founded what would become the Methodist denomination. He said, "Proceed with much prayer, and your way will be made plain." May we continue to move forward, steeped in prayer, ever open to the movement of God's Spirit. All praise and glory to the God who comes to us in Jesus and calls us to new life. Thanks be to God.